This pattern for the swirly snowman uses stem stitch. Now you could use any outline stitch. You could use split stitch, you could use back stitch, you could use chain stitch or any of the whipped chained or back stitches as well. I've used stem stitch because it's one of my favourite stitches, and also because historically it's one of the oldest embroidery stitches. Now I have gone through it when I did the main video, but I've got this thicker silk here to show you just the basics of split stitch before we begin the pattern. So what you do is you make one stitch down. Now this is a very thick thread, so I've done a longer stitch than I would normally. Normally I would do my stitch about maybe 2/3 that length. And what I'm doing is I'm coming up right in between those two stitches. And then I'm going about half as far along again and coming up where I put the first stitch in. Whoops, sorry, thick thread, it tangles a little. And then I'm just going to repeat that process over and over again whilst tangling it up with my microphone cord, because I'm so good at filming. So you can do it in a sort of one-step stitch if your canvas is a little looser. You can go through the back. And the reason stem is nice is it sits up from the canvas a little bit and it's got a bit of a texture. So it's kind of like a rope. Now what you've got to be really careful of with your stem stitch is that you always slide your stitch to the same side, because if you vary it, so if on this next stitch I go to the other side, oops, sorry, thick thread for demonstration purposes misbehaving, you can see that I'll then get a sort of lump in my stitching where it's gone to the other side. You see? And if I do that again, what I'll have is a sort of staggered brick stitch rather than a nice smooth rope. And I want the nice smooth rope. So I'll just do one more stitch to the wrong side again. You can see that it's just looking really messy there. It looks awful. So always to one side, never vary it unless you're changing direction. Now, what a lot of people are tempted to do, especially when they're learning something like stem stitch, is think, oh, I can go much faster with this, because what I'll do is I'll do a really long stitch and then I'll not go all the way back, and I'll just do it like that, and then that'll get it done really, really quick. But you can see that that's no longer a nice smooth rope. It's really ratty and straggly. You always go all the way back. And I always call stem stitch a back stitch variation. So if you look at this one, this is my waste canvas because this other frame doesn't turn over very well. This is the back of my neat stem stitch, and you can see it pretty much looks like a conventional back stitch. It's not perfect because it's the back, but this is the back of the ratty stem stitch where I haven't spaced it out. It's just a row of tiny little dots. And although the ratty stem stitch can look okay when you're on a straight line, as soon as you start to try and work around a curve with it, it can look absolutely awful. It just sticks out all over the place. So stem stitch, to be neat, should always look like back stitch. And you can see that going around that corner with that, it just looks absolutely awful. But if I take a line of conventional, well done stem stitch, and I take that round, oh, I've split that one by accident, never mind. And I take that round the corner, you can see it corners quite neatly. And when you're going around a very tight corner, you should always make your stitches a little bit shorter. Oops. because that shortness will neaten them up. So I've gone down to really quite short there to go around that curve. And you can see it's quite neat. It's just a nice thick little rope. But quite a lot of the time on this snowman design, you're going to want to take your curve, and I'm going to break that one into there. I'm just going to slide underneath it a little bit so they become one thing. I've just slid under the stitch, the line of stitch that I want to join to. Quite often when you're doing this stitch on this design, you're going to want to make a point. Even on the swirly bits, the little triangles that fill in make points. And what you do when you want to make a point is, say my point is, where's my pen gone? Say my point is here. I'm going to work past that point by about half a stitch. And then I'm going to bring this one out, and where I've brought it out the second time, that's where I want my stitch to end. And then you just cross it over and head off in the opposite direction. And that gives you a lovely sharp point. But you always do that by going slightly further than you want to. When you're doing a really tight corner, which you'll need to do on some of the knot work, you go around a really, really tight corner by just popping down at the end of that stitch, and I'm going to go one row of background canvas beyond it, and I'm going to take the thread across one row of the background canvas at the back, and then I can head in the opposite direction, and I'm going to have a really, really sharp corner on there. So it's all about tight curves and corners, really, really tiny stitches. Now when you come to the end of a row, if you're tucking it under another row, if you leave the end like that, your line is going to taper off. And when you're interlacing, you want all the lines to stay nice and fat. So what you do is you come up and you do a half stitch. And when you come up on the other side, when you dip under a line to interlace it, then you do another half stitch to begin, so that instead of, you can see there where I've begun that line, it's kind of tapered at the end of this one. So if I begin my line with another half a stitch, I begin the line as a fat, solid line, which is what we want to do most of the time. You don't want to do that on all designs, but on this design, I think you very much do, because it makes the interlacing look more convincing. This thread is just awful for doing this on this canvas. It's too thick for the canvas. It's nice for demonstrating because you can see it. But you can see that this one starts on a nice thick point. This one starts on a taper. So when you're going under and over, use those half stitches to taper in and out, and it'll make your interlacing look nice and neat. Hello, so we're going to start on this little Celtic snowman, and he's mostly going to be done in stem stitch. You could use split, you could use back stitch, you could even use chain stitch, but I'm going to use stem stitch because my thing is historical embroidery, and stem stitch is one of the oldest stitches in the world. It's used in, Paracas, pre-Columbian embroideries. It's used in Anglo-Saxon embroidery. It's used in medieval. It's one of the earliest embroidery stitches used all over the world. And stem stitch, really, it's just like back stitch, upside down. So what I'm doing is I'm going forward and I'm going back. And every time I go back, I'm pushing the thread to one side. And I'm always going to push it to the same side. Now, modern embroidery makes a distinction that if you go to one side you're doing stem stitch, if you go to the other side you're doing outline stitch. I honestly can't see the point in that, because if you turn it upside down it'll be the same way up anyway. So the trick to really nice stem stitch is that when you turn it over, the underside of it should look like a back stitch. You're not going to come out, right next to where you've just gone down. You're going to come up right on the edge of the next stitch. And because I'm working my stem stitch in these lovely tight spirals, I need to work fairly close together. So I'm using a linen canvas and I'm only going back about 3 stitches of the linen background canvas. So this thread that I'm using a silk thread, and this is a 30/2 NM silk thread used for weaving. It's sold for weaving. Now, I've been using this thread for embroidery for decades, and to be honest, I don't think I've ever done any weaving with it. It's a lovely, lovely silk to stitch with. It's very cheap compared to embroidery threads, so you can play with it, you can make mistakes with it, you can chuck bits of it out and it doesn't really matter. So it's not as expensive as some silk embroidery threads. And I quite like this for sewing. If you were going to use an embroidery cotton, you'd probably want 2 strands of a DMC cotton, or something like, I think, a 24 count in a De Beers silk, which is a plied silk. This silk is plied, it's not the filament silk that I use when I'm doing the Opus Anglicanum designs. Now this Celtic Spiral, we're doing him in lovely snowy blues. He's my design. I came up with him the other week and I thought I quite fancy stitching him, so I thought I'd do a little video. We're doing these Celtic spirals, and each spiral is done in 3 different shades of blue. So it's important that you get them right, that you follow for the colours, because you don't want to end up with 2 of the same blue in one spiral. They all interlock beautifully in 3 different colours, and if you follow the pattern properly, you should end up with 1 of each shade of blue in each spiral. So I'm just going to do the first spiral for demonstration, and I'll do all 3 colours, and then I'll come back to show you how to work on the rest of him. So I've picked blues, reds and purples. I quite like a bit of purple at Christmas. I quite like a bit of purple all year round. Now this thread that I'm using, it does come in a more limited range of colours. But as I said, it is cheap and it is very, very nice to work with. It makes a lovely sewing thread. I use it a lot. Now if you use a chain stitch on this, you want to be careful and make it quite a narrow one, I think, because I think you still want a gap between each of your spirals, because there needs to be some white, some negative space in between the lines to show that he's still a snowman. And the problem with that is, of course, that you've got to follow the lines quite precisely. I suppose you could use a washout marker, but I don't have any of those in the house. I always use permanent marker, so that's what I've marked with. You could use split stitch, which is another great historical stitch, although this isn't particularly a historical piece of embroidery, it's more historically inspired. But split stitch sits closer down into the fabric, and what I quite want here is that sort of rope-like effect that stem stitch gives. It sits up a little bit more proudly from the canvas. And I've got a linen canvas here. I quite often work on wool canvas, but I've chosen a linen because I wanted a sort of sparkling snow white shade, whereas a lot of the other linens that I had stashed and a lot of the other wools that I had stashed, they're more of an ecru or a cream colour. This was the sparkliest white one. So I'm nearly at the centre of this spiral. I'm not going to be far off. Oh, my cat's actually being sweet today. He sat down next to me. He's not whinging. He's not whining. He's not eating something he shouldn't be eating, so that I have to chase him around the room with a broom. Not that I would do that. I do swear at him a lot, though, because he's quite annoying. So what we've basically made here is a curly-whirly S shape. I quite like Celtic spiral patterns, but they are an absolute swine to draw. It took me ages to draft this pattern out, and then it took me ages more to work out the colours and get them right. So I'm nearly coming round into a quite tight curve. I'm getting quite small with my stitches here. Now there's actually quite a lot of mathematics and geometry in all Celtic patterns. And in this one, there's sort of a lot of mathematics of the number 3, because each one of these triangles, oh, I've forgotten to mark that one. There should be one, yes, that one there. Each one of these triangles will separate off into a different colour. So this one separates off into the mid blue. I've got a very turquoisey blue and I've got a navy blue as well. So I'm just going to use the rest of my bit of thread to continue this one on. And you can see that when I split it, I actually came up right under the thread that I'd already done, so that it blended in quite nicely. So I'm just going to finish this bit of blue off. I might not get right round to the centre of that spiral. Blue off because it shows you how they spiral out of each other. They're very sort of interconnected. I don't actually like working on linen very much. It resists the needle a lot more than wool. With wool you can always place your needle much more precisely, whereas a thick linen canvas like this, you have to go to one side of the, never go through them, because they're too stiff. Right, I'm just going to park that needle over there, because that shows how that one spirals off. And I'm going to go darkest blue now. I'm just going to anchor it at the back of it. And I'm going to bring that one out to here. Now it doesn't matter which one of these you follow with which shade of blue. What matters is how you connect them up afterwards, because they have to connect up in the right way. And part of that comes from continuing that spiral in the right direction and connecting the 3 spirals up properly. I'm sure much more maths in this than I understand. I'm not great at maths. Well, that turquoisey blue is really pretty, isn't it? That was not my neatest stitch, but never mind. So this one is going to come right out, and it's going to go into this one, and the third blue is going to go into this one. And then we have to connect them together. I did consider using 2 threads of this silk to have a thicker line, but I think I want him quite floaty. So a nice single line, and just being careful about where I put it, I think looks nicer. You may think otherwise, and you may want a thicker line, and that's absolutely fine. Because as I said, you don't have to use stem stitch. You could go for split. You could use backstitch, but I really think backstitch doesn't make a nice line. It's too lumpy. Even if you're very good at it, you can still see all the breaks in it. I think backstitch is better for holding things together. It's a seamstress stitch better than it is an embroidery stitch, I think. There are so many much nicer stitches for getting a nice smooth line with. You could of course do whipped backstitch, but that's an awful lot of work. And when you've got your lines as close together as this, you're always in danger of accidentally whipping through the wrong stitch. This polychrome effect of having several colours all coming out of one another, of course you could do this spiral all in one colour, and that would be a very modern sensibility, a very modern way of going about it. But medieval people, going as far back as when these Celtic manuscripts were illustrated, had this wonderful sense of the rhythm of colours. Now, they would have probably said, well, it doesn't matter that it's Christmassy and it's meant to be a snowman. Let's do one line blue, one green, one red, and really mix the colours up. I'm being a little bit subtle and modern here, just going for 3 shades of blue. But once you get these 3 shades in, you'll see that that rhythm that the colour creates is quite subtle, and it's very, very clever, because it just works. You think, oh, 3 different shades of blue all mixed together like that. Oh, that's going to look fussy, that's going to look messy. But it doesn't, it looks lovely. Once you get it all together and everything worked through, it's going to look fab. Or at least I think it's going to look fab, but then I designed it, so I have to think that. I once did a publicity event for my day job, and I had a leaflet that said, you know, I'm very experienced at this, I'm really good at it, blah, blah, blah. You know, nobody can better my experience. And this mad woman came up to me and had a right go, saying, how dare you say that your experience is unrivaled in this field? I am sure there are plenty of other people who are much better at this than you are. And I thought, well, yeah, but I'm not going to get very far. I'm going to sell myself very well, am I? Like sitting there going, oh yeah, well, I suppose I'm all right, yeah, I'm fine. But there are other people who are much better than me, why don't you hire one of them? Honestly. There's nothing wrong with ringing your own bell now and then. Or blowing your own trumpet. So I'm nearly at the centre of this one. And again, I'm going to continue this one out until I've got to the end of this thread. And I'll let you see again how to split it out once I get to that point. So notice again that I'm going much, much closer together with my stitches now that I'm getting to the centre of this design. So basically what you're doing is where in the centre of your spiral you're coming to 3 colours, this bit around your triangle is coming out to 4, to 3 again, sorry. Where did I get 4 from? It's been a long day. So I'm just going to pop down in the centre of there and then come out, well, I could come out there or I could come out there. And it doesn't really matter which one I do, because whichever I do, I'm going to have to come back and finish in the 3rd side of the triangle later. Because each one of these belongs to one colour. And I have made a slight drafting error on my 3rd triangle, but I shall put it right. I just forgotten to draw a line in. I'm good at that. So I'm going to continue that spiral out until I've run out of thread. So that one's going to go right round into the centre of that one. And then my 4th colour, why am I obsessed with 4? My 3rd colour, haha, got it right, is a darker blue. And I could have gone for white, but white I thought would stand up. It would look like, you know, a nice piece of white work. But then it wouldn't stand up against the blues. And I want it to be able to hold its own. So I'm going for a darker blue instead of a white. And I've just got a tangle at the back there. There we go. A pearl cotton would work very well for this as well, actually. Probably better than a stranded. So I'm just bringing my 4th colour out there. And working round. Now what I'm going to do is, rather than bore you, I'm going to work this out. And I'm going to work this out in these 2 sides, because those 2 are the sky blue. These 2 are the turquoise blue. And these 2 are the dark blue. So I'm going to come back when I've worked round all those spirals in my split stitch, and I'm going to show you how that works. Well, I've just come back as I finished the dark blue part of the spirals on the snowman. because I wanted to point out that each colour is laid out in exactly the same way with this pattern. All of the movement is pretty much anti-clockwise. All of the spirals go anti-clock. Blue, you've got your sort of triskelet with your 3 arms here, and then either side of that you've got the one that's just a curl, and then on the opposite side you've got the one that's like a big offset S shape. And all of the colours, I've just done this little drawing, all of the colours move around in exactly the same way. So the dark blue will go like this with the triskelet on this side. The mid blue will go like this with the triskelet on that side. And the very pale blue will go like this with the triskelet on the other side. So you're basically doing the same pattern 3 times in 3 different colours, and you're just rotating it by 120 degrees every time you do a different colour. So I'm going to go and finish the rest of those blues, and then I'll come back to you when I've done those. Right, so I have done all of the Celtic swirls on here, and you can see that the 3 colours tone and interlock quite nicely now. On none of these circles are there 3 spirals exactly the same. I've also used the sort of dusty mid blue to outline the snowman, and I've used it to do the lines of the snow underneath him. I've used a bit of the blue to outline the side of his head. And very, very simple little carrot for his nose. I've used a pop of orange for that and a pop of green for the tree. And I've started doing the knot work with the most simple one, which is just 2 strands twisted. It's just about the most simple form of knot work that you can possibly do. And that's a good place to start before you go on to one of these more complicated ones, because it still works on the same principle. Whether it's 2 strands spiralling together or half a dozen interlocking strands, all knot work adheres to the principle 1 under, 1 over, 1 under, 1 over, 1 under, 1 over. And that's exactly what this does here. I've been working my way down, and I'm just going 1 under, 1 over. And really all you're doing for this simple, it's almost like a barley twist form of knot work, is a series of elongated S shapes that interlock with one another. So it's really, really simple. So I'm going to do this little S shape here. Now it doesn't matter sometimes if there's a tiny little gap in the canvas between the threads with your rows of stitching, because it sort of adds depth to where they interlock and interlace. So don't obsess with making them connect up perfectly. If there's a tiny little gap and you can see a little bit of white at the end of each row, that's absolutely fine. So you can see I'm just working a little S shape here. And then I'm going to put that needle down, and I like to park my threads on the surface, because if I put them at the back I tend to find I get all tangled up at the back, whereas if I park them at the front I can see any tangles and deal with them before they happen. But I've just done that S shape there. Sorry, my hand was shadowing it there. I've just done that S shape there, and then I'm going to do exactly the same S shape. Oops, my thread's come undone. I'm going to do exactly the same thread S shape on the other side. So I'm coming up here and just doing another S shape. And I'll continue doing those little S shapes until I've finished his barley twist staff. There's only really a few little bits to do. And you can do them one at a time, as I've just done with these two colours. Or I could finish this little S shape here and then go on and do the final one. It really makes no difference whichever is easier for you. I tend to like to do one colour at a time, so I'll only have one needle on the go and I'll do one long stretch of the very dark blue and then I'll finish the paler blue. I find that easier than trying to manage two needles at once. I always like to keep things simple, no matter how complicated the piece of embroidery I'm doing. I think if you break it down into its simplest, smallest parts, then it becomes a far less intimidating thing. So I'm going to just finish this last little bright blue S shape. I'm going to take it right down to where he's planted his staff into the snow. And then once I've done that one, I'll be able to continue on with the blue one, the very dark blue one, without any interruptions. And really I'm using the dark blue in place of where I would have black in any other picture, because I'm trying to tone this one mainly in blues. I'm using that dark blue in place of black. So I've finished off that bright blue and I can go on to just finish the rest of that staff in that very, very simple interlacing. Now I've already made a start on his face up here, and you can see that I've done one of his eyes and it's got a nice little bit of a shine to it. I don't know how well you can see that, but I'm going to show you how to do the other one because I'm not going to do it in satin stitch. I generally tend to avoid using satin stitch for anything more than a couple of millimetres in depth. So I'm actually going to start off with a little bit of satin stitch, but I'm only doing satin stitch over 2 strands of the canvas, and I'm almost giving him one mad eye there because I'm just doing the very tiny little pupil in the middle. Now you could satin stitch if you find it easier, but I'm not a fan of satin stitch. I think it's very hard to get right and it's very easy. I like small stitches. I don't like big stitches. It's very easy to catch big stitches on things, and it's that ease of catching things that bothers me. Even if you're giving something as a gift and you think it's going to be hung on the wall, that you don't know what somebody's going to do with it. You don't want them thinking, oh, that's a bit of rubbish embroidery because I've just brushed against it and pulled all these threads out and now I'm putting it in the bin because it's ruined and I can't put it right again. Nice small stitches are much more robust than big ones, and I think it's always worth taking the time to do a nice small stitch. So I've put that little dot in the middle and then I'm working round and round and round it with basically just more stem stitch. You could use split stitch, which would work just as well. Now at this point where my circle is still really, really small, my stem stitch is kind of sticking out a bit at the sides, but I'm going to cover all those bits. It's much better to get a good layering and have it nicely covered. Just don't worry about that at this stage. Doesn't matter if the inner circles are a bit on the jaggedy side, as long as the outermost one is nice and smooth. So I'm just building up layers until I've got that done. And I'm going to try and make both his eyes the same size. That does help. Otherwise he will look like a crazy snowman. He does look quite crazy at the moment, doesn't he? He looks like he's got one big eye and one little eye, and he's giving you a bit of a funny look. And I've stitched through my thread there. I'm just going round and round. As opposed to snowmen, human beings must look very odd indeed, because we're not made of frozen water, we're made of squishy water flushing around. They must think we're very strange creatures. Now, what I've done here is I've made a bit of a mistake at some point, and I've sewn through my thread. Really, nothing I can do about that other than try and cut it away to loosen it up again. I think that is, I don't know if anybody else does it, but I do it all the time with split stitch, that I accidentally split the wrong kind. With stem stitch, I'll accidentally split through the end of the thread. And it's not a knot as such, it's more that the thread won't move along with the needle. It seems to happen more with wool than with silk. When I do stem stitch with wool, I'm always splitting the stitch by accident. So all I'm going to do now is just continue to work out until I've reached the right point and got his eye filled out. It doesn't have to fit exactly within the circle that you've drawn. As I said earlier, I always use a permanent marking pen, so I have to cover my lines. You might use a fade out pen, but I always think a drawing is a guideline. Now, with something like Celtic knotwork, you have to take it a bit more seriously. But with a face or an organic image, then the drawing is really just a guideline to tell you where you ought to be, sort of roughly-ish. You can add a lot of character by straying from the original drawing, because what works in a drawing and what looks fantastic on the paper isn't always going to work in stitch. So you've got to add yourself, allow yourself that little bit of creativity and movement once you start. It's not an absolute rule. Now, I might be looking at it from a funny angle, but I think his eyes are nearly... Oh no, he needs another... Sorry, I just looked at the camera. He needs another row around. I was viewing him from a slightly skewed perspective, and he looked about right. But then when I looked through the camera, I could see that the eye I'm working on isn't big enough yet. So I'm just going to put one more row round and see how I go. I think that might be about there. And then of course his mouth is made out of little spots of coal stuck into his face. So we're going to have blue coal, because I don't want to use black. Black I find can be very, very harsh in embroidery, especially if you've used a lot of soft colours. You might be better off using a brown instead. And to create my little dots of coal, it's not worth doing a stem stitch because the area is too tiny, and it's not worth splitting a stitch. So you could use a French knot if you wanted to go with a modern stitch. I'm just going to stick with a medieval solution and do these tiny little, just clusters of splits of what's really just satin stitch, just little stab stitches over the top to create his mouth. And then once I've done his face, I'm going to move on and start on all that much more complicated knotwork. I accidentally filmed one of these knots without putting my microphone on, so I was blathering away to myself and you couldn't hear me. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do 2 of these knots, and I'm going to do one side of the outline just to show you how the colours interact with each other. Now, if this was a proper medieval or Celtic pattern, then it would be too much more contrasting colours that we'd be using. They would quite likely have gone for something bright and jolly like red and green or blue and yellow, and then filled all of the knotwork, whether it was blue or yellow or red or green, with a row of little spots in possibly purple or red or something like that. The alternating colours thing works very well with this particular pattern because it is made from 2 strands. Now, because I want to make the 2 strands into a scarf, then I've got 2 different colours, and I'm going to have to connect them together at the corners here. You can see I've got 2 different colours of blue coming out of the same spot there. Now, it's the same principle as before. It's just under 1, over 1, under 1, over 1, even though it looks like a much, much more complicated pattern. It's still the same principle of under 1 and over 1. Now, when you get to the end of a piece like this, you need to be careful how you finish off your split stitch, because if I get to the end of here and then I finish it on a long end, it's going to look straggly and peculiar. So what I need to do is, that's a very messy bit of split stitch, I'm going to tidy that up later. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do my little split stitch, and then you can see I've come straight back out again, and I'm going right in at the same end, and that'll continue that rope-like effect that we want from our split stitch without making the end go straggly, so it looks like it's a proper interlaced rope lacing together. So I've done one of my knots in the darker blue, and I'm going to do my second knot in the middle blue now. So I'm coming out from the same spot, because quite often you get these patterns, and you get them in Celtic knotwork and you get them in medieval border patterns, where they'll just switch colour halfway along for no apparent reason, just because they feel like it. And that's fine. But we're interlacing them at the corners because we want to go and have the alternating colours on his little snowman scarf. So I'm going to come up and remember, I'm going to do a half stitch at the end of my row. So I'm going to come up there, and I'm just going to do a little half stitch there, just to hold the whole thing together so that it makes a nice continuous rope. Now, when I come back out again on the other side, because remember I've just dipped underneath, I'm going to do another half stitch, but the other way. I'm going to come out really close to where I began. And when I get up to the corner, remember when you do a tight curve in split or stem stitch, you always make your stitches a little bit smaller. Well, because these little corners are very, very tight and need to be really quite precise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to this corner with a normal size stitch. And you can see I'm going to finish that stitch on a half stitch. Then I'm going to come right into this corner and I'm going to do one tiny, tiny stitch that's only going under one thread of the canvas. And that's going to give me that lovely sharp corner. So that I can start that on a half stitch again and continue on. So what I'm going to do is you can see that my two blue knots interlace with each other quite nicely now. And I'll just finish this one knot and then I'll come back to you when I've finished the rest and we'll take a look at the brim of his hat, because that's a pattern that's one continuous thread, and we're going to look at how we can make it into two colours, because really for proper Celtic knotwork you need to vary the colours. It looks very modern, I always think, and a little bit off when you don't do it with the varied colours. And I think because we've varied the colours throughout our snowman pattern, if we then go and do the brim of his hat all in one continuous colour, he's going to look a bit peculiar. So we have a couple of options. We could do him all in one colour, as I said before. Now I've come to a corner there, so I'm going to go around it by just dipping under one thread of canvas. So I'm keeping that corner lovely and tight. Going to get that lovely sharp look to the corner. And when I come down, it's only 2 steps, 2 stitches to the next bit. When I come down to that, I'm going to do a half stitch again. So you don't always continue along the whole way. So we could do with that top band on his hat, we could do it all in one colour and then put a row of dots in a different shade of blue all the way along the middle of the band, which is a very, very medieval and Celtic thing to do. Or we could do one side of the band in one shade of blue and the other side of the band in another shade of blue. And that would look quite Celtic as well. Now when I move up to his hat, I'm going to take the two darker shades of blue, whereas at the bottom here, I'm using the dark shade for his scarf. Or I could just split that knot into and do part of it in one colour and part of it in another. So while I'm doing this one, I'm going to have a little think, because I haven't decided yet. I probably should have done a full-scale drawing, but I didn't. So I can follow this knot all the way down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow it down to that point there, and then I'm going to have both the colours meet at that point, and then I'm going to go back and do the other side of the knot. So I'm going to go and do that other side of the knot, and I'll come back to you when we do the top knot on his hat. I've done the little pom-pom on the end of his hat as a sort of 3-coloured swirl to echo the swirls in the centre of his belly. And you can see that I've started doing the knotwork along his hat. Now this is a very similar knotwork to the one on his scarf, but I'm doing it in 2 different colours because I want to bring the paler blue up. So I've used the mid blue on both, and I'm using the paler blue on the top. Now this, as you can see, this piece of knotwork makes one coherent whole, and you could do it as one piece. But what I've done is I've started at that far corner there. I've come along, I've done this knot in the mid blue, I've come up to here, and then I'm going to do this sweep along the bottom in the pale blue and the second knot in the pale blue. So the two knots will interact with each other, the two colours will interact with each other, but you'll see the knots quite separately. So I'm just going to start up here and work my way along. Oops, shouldn't have done that. I've just been thinking actually the little knots on his scarf, they look like pretzels, don't they? Do you think he's going to go to the Christmas party, and if they run short of nibbles, he'll be all right? So these two blues are much closer together than the other two. So this colour contrast is going to be much more subtle. But it will still be a contrast. And it means that it's got all three shades of blue, his hat now as well. I think with mixing the colours together everywhere else, if we'd done his hat in all one colour, it would have just stood out and looked too weird. If you mix one of the colours with this style of artwork, you have to mix all of them, or it just starts looking peculiar. Now, I'll put a link at the end of the video because I'll put the PDF pattern on my shop for you. It won't be very much, it's just a few quid. I've never done a PDF pattern before. I'm not going to put stitch instructions with it because you've got those on the video. So the idea is that you can use the PDF pattern to stitch along with the video if you want to do this pattern. So I'm just moving along and putting the two colours together. I really like that mid blue, it's really vibrant turquoise, isn't it? It's funny, I never liked turquoise as a stone, but I love it as a fabric colour. I think it's gorgeous. So we're nearly there with this hat finished. I do have one final touch I want to do after the hat, but we'll see. So you can see now that the two knots are going to be distinct but quite subtle differences in shades of blue. But the different colours in the knots will just make them stand out a little bit more. And I'm just going to follow this around until I meet up with that corner there. And then I'll go back and do the double strand of the double outline. So this is really no different to doing the other knots that we did in his scarf. It's a slightly more complicated knot, but it's the same principle. So if you had a longer version of this band, you'd have the two colours alternating by one band swooping under the other, as we've got here. So it's that same principle of two colours. Oh, I've just pulled the needle out again. Rubbish this morning. There. It's that same principle of tying two colours together in the one knot. It's just a slightly more complicated knot. I'm sure the one in the other border, the scarf border, will have a name for those of you who know the names of knots, which does not include me. But I'm not sure if this one would. There's some very complicated knots in knot work. So there's his little hat, nearly finished. And you can see that what I've done on this one is I've actually staggered the break between the two colours. Round on the other corner, I've done it right at the corner. On this one, I've staggered it over the two. Just because it's nice to have a change, I thought I'd do it two different ways. You can stagger it at the point of the corner if you prefer. Now he's almost finished. This is one more thing I want to play with. Swirly Snowman is almost complete, but I think he needs just a little bit of sparkle. Now I could have used a metallic thread, but instead I'm going to use some of these, which I got from a discontinued supply, but anything sparkly will do really. Any crystal, or you might find some little sparkly snowflakes or something. These ones are a lovely Austrian crystal. They're quite old ones. I think they're from the 50s. And I'm just going to sew a few of those down just to give a little sparkle. I've actually got these left over from doing my stepmother a Christmas coat. Now, for these you need a really, really fine needle, and they're horrible to thread, and just a little bit of white silk. So I'm going to anchor that behind here. Now you can see that these crystals that I've got, they're not buttons. They've only got the one hole. So I've also got some clear glass beads. And I think the easiest thing to do is to put the needle through first and then come through. So I'm just going to put one of those clear glass beads. Oh dear. There we go, sparkly snowman. You could use sequins, you could use some historically accurate spangles. I think these are historically accurate for Elvis in his Vegas period, so that's fine. But this is Swirly the Snowman, and I hope somebody else will enjoy sewing him because I've had fun with him.